Water. We all rely on it. We drink it, we swim in it, we clean ourselves with it. We take it for granted, and we think we own it. But do we really? Across the whole world, what was once public water is slowly being bought by private companies and sold back to us at high prices. Is water a public commodity? Should private companies be able to buy our water? Is water even a basic human right?
Our journey begins in Lake Station, Indiana in 2017. Industry has declined in America over the last few decades, and towns like Lake Station have suffered as a result. Nearby steel mills have laid off workers, the town has gone into debt to build a new city hall, and the financial situation is so dire that the city is considering laying off some of its police officers. Lake Station needs money, and it needs it fast. That's where water privatization steps in. If Lake Station sells its water to a private company, it can eliminate millions of dollars worth of debt. But at what cost? Citizens of towns in which water is privatized complain of high prices and poor service. And when these towns try to get their water back, they often have to argue an eminent domain case in court. But even if the town wins such a case, they must pay extremely high prices determined by the court to get their water back. Prices that are high enough to plunge a small town into economic ruin. If this seems unfair, that's because it is. Large water companies are taking advantage of the financial woes of small American towns, and these towns often don't have reasonable recourse. And, from an economic perspective, it doesn't seem to make sense. But what about an ethical perspective? Is water even a basic human right? In America, we don't typically have to worry about the availability of water. Even if it gets more expensive, we are unlikely to lose access to it totally. Most public places have water fountains, and water bottles are available for cheap prices at any nearby convenience store. But the story is different in the water-poor parts of Africa. Our journey continues in Ghana. In this part of Africa, residents must worry about how much water they use. They want to make sure they have enough to survive. Private companies have been buying the water supplies in these African countries and have been charging exorbitant prices that many residents can't afford. In Ghana, privatization increased water costs by 95%. Many Ghanaian residents can't afford such expensive water and must resort to using unsafe water, which can lead to adverse health effects. Here in Arizona, the water security of Native American peoples is often under question.
That in Arizona, and I think in a lot of countries, arguably another sector is indigenous people. Indigenous populations have struggled to have their own right to water recognized, and they use their water for all the things that non-indigenous populations use their water for, including agriculture and industry, and to bring water into their homes. But at least in many countries, they have a bigger commitment to making sure some water is set aside for the environment.
Governments privatizing water often prevent indigenous people from accessing that water. In 1981, the Chilean government privatized their water and neglected to give indigenous peoples in the area enough information. As such, the indigenous people of Chile lost access to their water rights. Some similar things have happened here in the United States.
And that Winters case more or less said that the United States government, in its treaties with First Nations, had made clear that those First Nations would receive water regardless of other claims by anyone who was not First Nations. This is actually a rather dramatic judgment because it means more or less that no water in the Southwest could be used except by First Nations because their claims are expansive, or they've been narrowly interpreted to say some version of you can watch the river go by, but we're not going to let you plant crops, and we're certainly not going to let you, do fracking with your water.
Despite this decision, Native Americans were not well informed enough to take advantage of these newfound water rights, and Native American water rights are still under threat today. However, is privatization actually that bad, or are people just worried about the boogeyman that they see privatization as? Many American water systems that are government-owned are still not appropriately maintained. In Flint, Michigan, neglect by city officials to appropriately manage their water infrastructure led Flint water poisoning many Michiganders with lead. In this case, failure to properly maintain water supplies fell in the hands of the government. These water problems happen all over the U.S., even though most cities don't have corporate-owned water. As such, it is reasonable to assume that a for-profit business that buys up this water would either meet or possibly exceed the standards that governments like Flint's have set. It would also be wrong to assume that corporate water is the wild west of water privatization. These companies must still abide by the same federal regulations that the government needs to. If corporate lives up to the same or better standards as government water, what really is the harm in a city selling its water to make a bit of money, like Lake Station or hundreds of small towns across the USA? When we set out to make this documentary, we all agreed that we didn't like private water. But as we learned more, our opinions changed. We learned that this is a topic too complex and nuanced to be boiled down into a few minutes of video. We think about the people of Ghana, who can no longer afford to pay for safe water because a private company bought it. But then we think about the people of Flint, Michigan, whose government has failed them where a private company may have succeeded. We think about the Native Americans of Arizona, who haven't been given appropriate means to access the water they deserve. But we also think about how corporate water is just as regulated as government-owned water. So we ask you, the audience, to think about what we should do about privatization as we move into the future. Should we support private water wholly, without any reservations whatsoever? Or should we make private water illegal and make it a public right? Should we support